EMF impacts life at such a fundamental level that it manifests through multiple biological systems. So it isn't actually surprising that you see it you see impacts on the brain or on the thyroid or on the genitals and gonads or on physiological patterns, or that you see it on trees just like you do on humans.
This is the Mind Body Detox podcast, where we discuss all things integrative health and wellness, interviewing folks from all over the world, sharing insights and wisdom on how to live a healthier life in mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back to the Mind Body Detox podcast. I am your host, integrative intuitive medium, Kara Lovehart, and today's guest is very special. His name is R. Blank. He is a technologist, an entrepreneur, a writer, and the CEO of Shield Your Body. Now, the reason why I had R. Blank come on the podcast today is, of course, I'm always looking for professionals who offer something to really help us to detox in all ways, mind, body, and spirit. Information that R. Blank has offered on the effects of EMF radiation on our health are just astounding. And so for me personally, as an intuitive and as a sensitive, I have experienced EMF sensitivity or electromagnetic frequency sensitivity. And so we get this exposure through cell phones and laptops, and we're going to go and talk about that. But it's so important to note that R. Blank is the son of Dr. Martin Blank, and he co-authored with his father the book called Overpowered. And this book is widely regarded as one of the best books written on the science of the health effects of EMF radiation. And if anyone who knows me, I'm all about the science. Our guest today also has his degree from Columbia University and UCLA, and he also is the host of the Healthier Tech podcast. And of course, I'll be leaving links for that in the show notes. Now, my guest's mission is to make technology safer. And of course, as a sensitive, I'm all about this. So let's dive into this interview. What exactly are EMFs and what is your experience with them? I'm curious if you yourself are sensitive to them.
EMF stands for electromagnetic fields, and it's a form of energy made up of a combination of electrical and magnetic forces, as the name suggests. Now, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of EMF. One that everyone's familiar with is sunlight, right? The energy that we get from the sun is a form of EMF, so all visible light. And what's interesting about that is, given all the different types of EMF that exist, sunlight is really the only form of EMF that humans and all life on Earth was exposed to for several billion years until the invention of the light bulb, right? And there are a couple others, like lightning is a form of EMF, and the Earth has its own magnetic field, but those are so weak that really the only form that humanity and life on Earth was exposed to was sunlight. But then I mentioned the invention of the light bulb, right? So all the different types of EMF exist on what we call a spectrum. There's a spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. You have certain kinds with more energy than the sun, more sunlight. And those have so much energy that they can knock electrons loose from your cells. And that's really harmful. So those types you might have heard of, right? There's X-rays and gamma rays and even UV rays. And we all know that those are really dangerous, even in very, very, very low doses. Then there's absolutely no dispute on that. So then there's this whole segment of the EM spectrum with less energy than visible light. And those don't have the same amount of energy. They can't knock electrons loose from your cells. And that's why they're called non-ionizing. And there's a few different types of non-ionizing EMF. One is radio frequency, also sometimes called microwave. And that is used by everything that communicates wirelessly. So that's cell phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, radar, radio, television, everything that communicates wirelessly, that's RF or microwave radiation. Then there's even less energy. There's something called ELF, or extremely low frequency. And that comes off of anything that runs on electrical power. So that includes power lines, the wiring in your home, and appliances in your home, like refrigerators, blenders, and anything like that. So that, in a nutshell, is the broad strokes of what EMF is. And before I get to the rest of your question, the thing I will say is I mentioned that ionizing forms of EMF have always been universally acknowledged to be very, very harmful, even in very low doses. The non-ionizing forms, the radio frequency, the ELF, those were long thought to have been benign, harmless. And it's only about 100 years ago, really, that the science started emerging, showing that that assumption was false. And it's really in the past 30 years where the science really built up quite a bit of steam. And there's a lot of data now showing that this type of non-ionizing EMF radiation is harmful to human life and all life on Earth, even at doses that fall well within safety standards. Now, you asked how I came to learn about EMF. My father was Dr. Martin Blank, and he was one of the world's leading researchers on EMF and its health effects. And about 10 years ago, it was in 2012, he had a contract to write a book. And this book was for general audiences, not other academics and scientists. So this was for general audiences. So he asked me for help. And it was in the course of writing that book, which became called Overpowered, that I really was kind of hit with the inspiration to create what became SYB and to get more involved in helping people understand these risks. And the final part of your question was whether I am personally electrically sensitive. And I think we'll probably get into this in more detail later in the conversation, but there's a condition called electromagnetic hypersensitivity. And this is people who have symptoms and sensations resulting from their exposures to EMF radiation that other people don't feel in the same way. And I went through most of my life not feeling as though, even starting SYB for several years in SYB, not feeling electrically sensitive. And by and large, I'm still not. I don't have anything like the type of impact on my life that other people do. But I've gotten to a point in my life where I now sense, I can feel the difference when I'm in a city, because cities have so much more of this stuff than rural areas or even suburban areas. And when I am in a city, I definitely feel something that is charging me, definitely making it harder to sleep, definitely making it harder to get restful sleep. So I do believe that I've started to become aware of my sensation of these forces, but nothing like the types of harm and inconvenience and pain that other people report from suffering from EHS.
So about 10 years ago, exactly when you said that the book was Overpowered, correct? That's the name of the book. I'm going to be putting that information in the show notes for everybody, of course. But about 10 years ago, I was looking for someone like you and a company like SYB. Because 10 years ago was when I was experiencing electrohypersensitivity. But at the time, I thought it was just sensitivity being an intuitive professional, that I was just sensitive to energy in general. So I had a recognition that it was electromagnetic. And I still have my two best friends. They came over one day and I was at a point where I was really sensitive. And I said, you guys leave your cell phones in the car. And of course, I feel like a crazy person. I always joke like, yeah, I was like part of the Tinfoil Hat Society. And so they, one of them actually didn't. And I said, it's you have your phone in your pocket. Can you? And it was funny because my partner and I were very scientific and very skeptical about a lot of things. I think curiosity is the best way to approach all things. Yet when I was sensitive to these things, I was still skeptical about them. And my partner, I said to him, I can feel the Wi-Fi. And for those of you out there who maybe not have an idea of what electrosensitivity feels like, for me, I experienced it as almost like something, if you could have a person going like this around your body, like making like interruption or interference, and almost like a feeling like sometimes like a scratching feeling. It felt like a pressure. My heart rate would kind of change. I'd feel heart palpitations. I'd feel pressure on my chest, sensitivity in my skin. It felt like my skin was crawling. I experienced this when I remember I was at Walmart of all places, and within 10 feet of the register, I could feel, and I thought, do they use Wi-Fi for their payment processing? I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt like I entered into this bubble of, ooh. And of course I thought it was crazy. And my partner said, well, let me go turn off the Wi-Fi so you can sleep. And he went back out of the room, came back in, and I said, you didn't turn it off. Like, I can feel it still. And he goes, Really? I thought you were just crazy. I thought you were, and it's funny because I definitely met some people that there is a interesting correlation. I'm curious your perspective too, with working with people who've had electrosensitivity. A lot of my clients who are empathic and very sensitive, we do have some background with going through maybe toxicity levels in our body or other things that are affecting the nervous system to be hypersensitive. It can be trauma. It can be things like that make the electromagnetic field of the human aura sensitive to that stuff. But I'm curious about your experience with that too, with electromagnetic sensitivity in clients, because again, I'm going to be dropping ours podcast link in the show notes. You guys have to listen to it, because when I listened to, I think it was episode 3, I was like, this is exactly what I experienced. And your guest was so really informative of working with one of the former CEOs of Canadian Google was saying that they were electro hypersensitive, and it wasn't just that, you're a crazy person. So everything you guys are talking about on the Healthier Tech podcast is just really affirming everything I've experienced. So tell me about electrohypersensitivity in clients, and what did they experience?
Yeah, there's a wide range of symptoms, and they span from these sensations like things crawling along your body, up through rashes, up through more significant joint pain. There are some people who report pain so significant that they really need to upend their entire life and move to a place with just much lower levels. And there are almost anywhere you go that's more rural will have lower levels of background radiation of this human-made EMF than a city. But there are some places that have, by law, very, very low levels of EMF, and these are called radio quiet zones. And there's one it's been covered in documentaries and in the media several times in Greenbank, West Virginia. And there's some people who give up essentially their entire lives to move to these locations, and work is either impossible or very, very difficult. And they get rid of all. So for instance, in Greenbank, all the appliances, right, they're propane powered. They're not electrically powered. And certainly no Wi-Fi and cell phones. There is a broad range of symptoms that people report having manifest. I also know that part of the suffering is how hard it is to get people to believe that the condition is real.
Yes.
Because there's very few entities in the world that do recognize EHS, although there are some. Some people don't realize that there are some. So for instance, the government of, I apologize, I don't have my notes in front of me. I believe it's Austria and then also Sweden. I believe in Sweden, it's recognized formally as a disability. And in Austria, there's a different type of recognition that it has. And then there are some other institutions, for instance, the Women's College in Toronto is one that comes to mind, that offer a formal diagnosis and a treatment regimen for the condition.
Wow.
One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that there is actually a Medicare billing code for EHS.
Wow.
And so it can actually, when your doctor, if they diagnose you, which also can be a challenge, just getting a doctor who's aware of this condition and willing to provide that diagnosis, but they can actually put it down on the insurance forms that it's EHS. I forget the actual Medicare billing codes. I didn't memorize those, but they can actually note on your insurance form that it is sickness from radio waves. So, and I mention that because I think it is very important that people understand that part of the suffering is how hard it is to get people to believe you. When you compound that with the fact that if you are experiencing this, it's very hard to escape it without upending your lives. And there are some people who maybe don't give up their lives and move somewhere totally different, but they become effectively shut-ins because they can never go outside. Because I hear from people almost every week with questions about this who are suffering from these symptoms. And I hear the pain in what they are writing me. And it is tragic when you also realize, right, because what we're seeing with the EHS population is that there is a population who has a threshold of EMF sensitivity that is lower than the rest of us, right? But the amount of EMF in the environment keeps increasing every year, right? Because there's more cell phone towers, there's more smart devices, there are smart cars that are plowing through our streets, and more sources of these of these forces in our lives. And so the background levels are increasing. And that means more people are being triggered, right? Because you're starting to hit thresholds that apply to more people. So this condition, while still not universally recognized, is one that is, in my opinion, obviously real and is increasing. The number of people who are affected by it is increasing all the time. I will say one other point on EHS, which I think is important to get out there, which is a lot of people have symptoms of EHS and don't realize that it is EMF that is causing them.
Yes.
Right. So as we get into a discussion on health effects, we have obviously sleep disruption is a big one. We have anxiety. We have depression. We have tinnitus is a documented result of EMF exposure. There's this whole wide range of health effects that when I say them just sound like byproducts of modern life, right? And so if you're just a person going through their life and suddenly you develop tinnitus, I'm not saying that EMF caused that, but I am saying that person may well not believe, even think that EMF could be a cause.
Yep.
And so beyond the percentage of the population that reports that they're EHS, you have a much bigger, I believe, portion of the population that has EHS and whose lifestyle and quality of life is being negatively impacted by it, but has no awareness of that mechanism.
Yes, and it's very common, especially with what people are trying to do holistic alternative treatments for tinnitus or tinnitus, tomato, right? They actually maybe will try chiropractic care, or they'll try maybe some medication. As a lot of times they'll try different treatments, and it's very hard to treat. But I've definitely felt that a lot of the clients I work with, it is very nervous system, unless it's something that is neurological, because there's other things that can happen that can be culprit for tinnitus. But I find it interesting that the nervous system and how it's affected by electromagnetic fields isn't ever addressed. So I'm really glad that you're speaking on that. And I'm curious about the people who are really on that lower level for EHS and very sensitive. How on earth do they get educated about it in the first place? You know, because if they can't, it's hard for them to get on the computer. It's exhausting. I had a client that she would come in on the weekends when our center clinic was shut down, and I'd turn off all the electricity and even the air conditioning unit, because she was ELS, the electromagnetic low sensitivity. Is that what you said it was?
No. I think you're referring to ELF, which was a range on the EM spectrum.
Yeah, I think she was really sensitive to low.
ELF comes from, okay. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, so she was sensitive to the low frequencies. And so we turned it all off for her. And that was the only time she could come into our building. So how do these people find you if even listening to this podcast, like being around a device, or, how do they do that? I'm curious about that.
That's an interesting question. I should probably actually ask people that. I do know that there are some people, members of my community, members on my mailing list, my email list, who have very specific protocols. So they're not on their computer like you and I are on our computer. They will have their computer download all of, their emails, and then they'll go offline and read it. Most of these people, actually, even people who aren't EHS, a huge percentage of my customer base and community membership does not use Wi-Fi for these purposes. So you jack into an Ethernet cable, and then you don't need the EMF radiation coming from your Wi-Fi network or a cell phone in order to access this information. But like with almost everything in modern life, it is much more difficult and inconvenient for someone with EHS to engage. And it's with this content, it's with your podcast, but it's also with almost everything. It's getting a job or doing a job or going shopping. Everything is much more difficult. And again, I just would underscore that not only is this problem not going away, it is actively getting worse essentially every day because of the continual deployment of wireless infrastructure.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting. I have had what's also interesting to note is we also do paranormal investigation when we're doing house readings for people. A lot of times we've had clients call us and say, we're having, either they say poltergeist activity or we're having disturbances in the house. And so from a mediumship perspective, we go in there and there's nothing going on as far as supernaturally. So what I do is I'm going, that over there feels EMF. Like there's something going on there. Of course, we have EMF detectors too, so we could bring that. And it's so interesting to me that so many of these people are getting those smart meters installed. That's been like a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we had one of our clients that their teenager was starting to go through almost like a mental health issue because of this smart meter. And it was not surprising at all. We went in there and we're going, oh, wait a minute, this wall, what's on the other side of this wall? Oh, you have a smart meter. And it was like, wow. So I was so excited when I did look at your website and checked out your products because you have this really amazing EMF shielding. I'd love for you to talk about it later, but that goes behind a picture. Because at that time, what we did is we were trying to find something that would be metal or something that could be almost like a Faraday cage around that part of the wall for her. We had her get like I think it was like an aluminum or metal, like some sort of like poster or something that they sell. And that helped her and it helps deflect it. But I think that's interesting to note because I love you to talk on all these different things other than, smart meters. You said about Wi-Fi. What are other ways that are commonly we're experiencing EMFs that we don't know about it, especially for those people who don't have symptoms? There's so many people, like you said, that are not electromagnetically sensitive, but they may be getting the health effects.
So one that I remember learning early on in life because of who my father was. But one source that many people might find surprising is refrigerators, because as I mentioned, wireless technology gets a huge amount of the attention, and justifiably in many cases, because that's the one where the deployments are just exploding in quantity. EMF, there's certain types of EMF that also come off of power lines, electrical wiring, and as I mentioned, appliances. Refrigerators tend to be very, very large sources of this type of radiation. And the reason why this can be a big source, a hidden source for people, is a lot of people have, a refrigerator on this side of a wall and then a couch on this side of the wall, right? So they have a kitchen and a living room or something like that. And so they're sitting right behind their refrigerator for hours at a time whenever they're watching something or just lounging, reading a book in the living room. And these levels can be really high off of refrigerators. There are other appliances that can have equivalent, but again, the backs of refrigerators, you can find very, very high levels. And so that is oftentimes a hidden source. Another interesting way to respond to that question is people think of cell phones as a source of EMF because obviously they are, but really they are multiple sources of EMF, right? Because on any kind of modern smartphone, you're going to have the cell phone, you're going to have the cell phone data, you're going to have the Wi-Fi, you're going to have the Bluetooth. You might have NFC, which is near field communication, which is for things like Apple Pay and Google Pay. And you'll have GPS. And I just mentioned 6 different sources right there, and I might be forgetting 1 or 2. And so a cell phone isn't just a source of EMF. A cell phone is going to be about half a dozen sources of EMF. And actually what people should also be aware of is that people also tend to think of airplane mode as kind of an all or nothing thing, right? So if you go into airplane mode, your phone can't do anything. But the thing is you can actually turn off these sources individually. So you can just keep on the Wi-Fi and turn off the cell phone and the cell phone data and the Bluetooth and so forth. And same thing, you could just keep on the Bluetooth and turn off all the others. And you can often do this nowadays on I forget what the control center screen without having to load up the settings. You just pull down the drawer and you can choose which connections are on. And I strongly advocate that people learn how to do that and get comfortable doing that, because even when your cell phone is on, you can still really cut the amount of radiation coming off of it by controlling which radio cards are active and communicating.
So I wanted to talk about, for people who are not electromagnetically sensitive, to kind of go over again some of the health effects that they may be experiencing with EMF and then even the 5G, and what kind of things they can do for self-care. Because the one thing I was so excited to have you on the podcast was that you aren't eliciting fear with this information. So many people can get like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere. What do I do? And I've seen a lot of people and companies who get really very strong conviction about you need to do these things now. And I said, well, we can just educate and empower ourselves. So tell us about the health effects that we may not be aware of. Revisit that and tell us what we can do for self-care to build a healthy relationship with the technology that we have in our lives.
Sure. Okay. So in terms of the health effects, big takeaway I'd like people to have is that there are a very, very, very wide range, right? So it's not like we're looking, I mean, because for instance, brain tumors get a huge amount of the press because they are terrifying and they are linked to cell phone radiation. It's not just brain tumors and it's not just tumors and cancer, right? So you do have a fair amount of science on the brain tumors. You also have growing science on other types of tumors like thyroid cancer and colorectal cancer. But it's not just the cancers and the tumors, right? You have, I mentioned already, sleep disruption. That's a big one. That's a big one because it impacts so many people, but it's also, it feeds on itself, right? Because when you're not getting enough sleep, your body isn't rejuvenating and getting the energy it needs in order to fend off other conditions. You have infertility, subfertility. You have increased risk of miscarriage. You have Alzheimer. There's a growing body of research now on Alzheimer's and other forms of neurodegenerative diseases being strongly linked to EMF exposure. And it's not just in the humans. We see it across the natural world where, for instance, there are studies showing that EMF is a contributing factor. It is probably almost certainly not solely responsible, but a contributing factor to colony collapse disorder. You see it with
and that's with
any
bees.
species that relies.
In case anyone doesn't know,
Right.
that's with bees.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I appreciate. Thank you for the clarification. Any species that relies on magnetoception in order to navigate. So magnetoception is a sense of the Earth's magnetic field, which is how birds know where to go. It's how sea turtles know where to go. It's how any number of different species know where to go. And EMF can significantly interfere with those species' migratory patterns, which then leads to impact on their reproduction and their survivability. You see it in trees where RF exposure can kill trees and plants or really suppress their development. And I know when I say this to someone who's new to this topic, it can sound like a kitchen sink sort of accusation, like, oh, everything bad in the world is linked to EMF exposure. And what I want people to understand is, first off, I am not here to say EMF is the only toxin in the world creating damage. That is certainly not what I want people to take away from. But EMF impacts life at such a fundamental level that it manifests through multiple biological systems. So it isn't actually surprising that you see it you see impacts on the brain or on the thyroid or on the genitals and gonads or on physiological patterns, or that you see it on trees just like you do on humans, right? And I'll give one example. This is not the only example, but I'll give one example. Some of what many people, including myself, believe is some of the most important research on EMF was done in the 90s by a couple of doctors named Dr. Henry Lai and Dr. Narendra Singh out of Washington State. And across multiple experiments, they showed that at the time they were using cordless phones, but they showed that cordless phone radiation, even very short doses, so we're talking 15 minutes of exposure to a cordless phone, led to significant and measurable increases in DNA strand breaks. So what that means, right? DNA is formed of two strands. And DNA carries all of our genetic information. And I'm mentioning it here particularly because not only is it very important to life, it is in every cell. It is in every living cell, right? So it is shared. Every part of our body has DNA in it. And what they showed is that it leads to strand breaks. And again, DNA has two strands. If both strand breaks, the cell will kill itself. And that is actually the preferable outcome that you want because you can also get single strand breaks. And when only one strand of DNA breaks, there's enough information on the other strand that the cell will attempt to rebuild the broken strand from the remaining strand. And it is in that process where mutations happen. And mutations are a key mechanism by which diseases form and spread. There's another aspect of their work, which, by the way, has been both peer-reviewed and replicated multiple times, is that the increased rates of DNA damage persisted for hours after the exposure.
Wow.
So just 15 minutes of exposure to cordless phone radiation, which technically is very, very similar to cell phone radiation, not only led to increased rates of damaged DNA and the mechanism by which mutation occurs, but that damage persisted for hours after the exposure. That is one reason why you see the actual health effects across so many different biological systems, because EMF is impacting our bodies at such a fundamental level. And because we're surrounded by it, we're not just exposed to it in one part of our body. It's our entire body is exposed to this stuff in different degrees, but basically 24/7 and in today's world. And so that is why you have such this broad range of health effects that are being, the way I like to say it is basically every biological system where we take these measurements, you are seeing negative health outcomes as a result of these exposures.
Yeah. And all I keep thinking about is, of course, back in my day, it was cordless phones for the years of being a teenager and wanting to socialize on the phone all the time. And now it's, being on tech, even laptops or tablets or phones for children that are even like under the age of 3. So who is at the highest risk then? Is it children? Is it adults? Is it elderly? Who's at the highest risk for EMF health effects?
So yeah, the great question. The younger you are, the more vulnerable you are to this type of damage. For a few reasons. And when I say the younger, I mean, teens are more vulnerable than adults. Children are more vulnerable than teens. Babies are more vulnerable than children. And fetuses are more vulnerable than babies, right? So it goes all the way up that spectrum. So one of the reasons is because their bodies are just smaller. If you have a cell phone and you're holding it up to your head, which you should never do, but if you're holding a phone up to your head, and let's just pretend like the radiation goes in an inch from the source from the cell phone. On a full-grown adult, that inch represents a much smaller portion of the entire head than it does on a child, right? That same inch on a child is actually percentage-wise a much bigger portion of their brain. Then you also have the fact that any damage, right? Children, the younger you are, the faster you are growing. Mm-hmm. That means that any damage that happens will multiply more rapidly because of how the cell division and growth process works. And a third reason, and this isn't a comprehensive list, but this is some of the biggest reasons. The third reason is that the younger you are, the longer your body has to live with the damage that results. And so that gives more time for the damage to spread and for disease to manifest, right? Some of these conditions we're talking about can take 10, 20, 30 years to manifest. And so the earlier the exposure, the more time the body has to live and cope with the damage resulting from that exposure. And I mentioned fetuses specifically because a lot of people kind of intuitively grasp that a baby is more vulnerable to damage than a teen or an adult. But there is significant research that has been performed into fetuses, pregnant women. And I'll just give a couple of examples here. So one is out of Kaiser Permanente, Dr. Di-Kun Lee showed that women who had higher exposures to magnetic fields when they were pregnant had a 2.72 times increased rate of miscarriage. And that was, again, just from magnetic field exposure.
So what about ultrasounds?
Miscarriage is terrifying. Wow, that's funny. I just had someone email me this morning about ultrasounds.
Yes, because people get them often, and I always wonder about them.
Yeah, well, ultrasounds use sound, not radiation. So it's a different form of energy, right? They use sound, not EMF, to take the measurements. But the actual machine that generates the sound and reads the measurements is apparently a pretty significant source of magnetic field emission. But, I am not a healthcare provider. I am certainly not going to tell people not to have important
they're definitely needed
checkups done. Yeah. But the example that I can give, which applies to my life, which is dental x-rays. When I go to a dentist, particularly in the United States, they try to make me have my teeth x-rayed every single time. And I assume it's because they make some more money, right? Because there is unless they see something or I'm reporting some unusual pain, there's absolutely no reason to have x-rays done on your head every 6 months. And so, but all the dentists will that I've ever been to, they try to make you do that. Some won't even see you unless you agree to it. And so I've made it a policy of mine to not get dental x-rays more than every 2 years unless I absolutely need, unless there's like some compelling reason to. So I certainly advocate taking a more intentional approach to these types of exposures. Don't do it just because a healthcare provider is telling you to do it, because at the end of the day, it is you and it is your body. And you really need to weigh the pros and cons, because x-rays, like I said, x-rays are really serious. Those are really serious. There's a reason they cover you in a lead jacket and leave the room while it's happening, right? Yes. These are really serious exposures. So I think that's relevant to your question, but I don't want to make it sound like ultrasounds are like x-rays, because they are not, but they are additional exposures. But in many cases, it is entirely probable that the mother has more exposure, maybe when she's at work, sitting at her computer around 5 other people working on their computers with the Wi-Fi going and everyone having a cell phone on their desk and so forth, than that mother would from the ultrasound.
So when you're talking, I'm thinking about 10 years ago when I was looking for a company like you offer, because I, of course, was experiencing electrohypersensitivity, and I was like, well, this is how I feel when I'm around Wi-Fi. There's a lovely park in the area that has a lot. When you get to a certain area of the park, there's a lot of transformers there. You can even hear the buzzing, and you just within a certain feet, I'm like, oh, I can't even be around that. And then I had some x-rays done, and it was a very different, I call it like an energy signature. It felt different, but it still affected me. And I felt like really tired for like a week afterwards, after the x-rays. And I thought, why don't people experience this? We got to do something about this. And so I was in this whole thing where I was like learning about it, and as much as I could find on the internet at that time, and still trying to convince myself that I wasn't crazy. And so I found, of course, what a Faraday cage was. And I was like, wow, wait a minute. There's fabric for people who work with electromagnetic stuff. Like if they're working, they don't want like the electricians and stuff so they don't get shocked. Wait a minute. There's got to be a way to create like a cool hat or a head covering or something to cover my body. And then I thought about pregnant women, and I went on this whole thing. And then I'm like, someone's got to create this. Someone has to create a company that does this. So I would love to kind of go and like, that's why I was so excited when I went on your website, and even like the EMF protective underwear for men. I was like, this is great. So I would love to have you to share a little bit, like, what is a Faraday cage? Like, how does some of the products work? I want to know a little bit more about that, and then go into like, why aren't there tech safety regulations? I'm excited to hear about that.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you I'm glad that you had such a positive reaction to my catalog.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I'll preface that answer by saying, if your listeners go out and they just search for EMF protection on Google, they will find a very wide range of potential solutions, ranging from, pendants and crystals up to stickers that they claim you can put on your phone to make the EMF safe.
And I have,
but in contrast to that, as you know,
real quick, I have some of these guys here just to show. These are Orgonite. These are like the first thing I could find. And I was, again, I'm thinking, well, how are these effective? How do you prove that they are? But again, there was a lot of stuff out there. So I just want to show that for people who are watching the video of what those are. Go ahead. I apologize to interrupt, but I wanted to show those.
So, no, there's all sorts of different things. So if you're just starting your search and you don't know what you're going to find a lot of different things. So in contrast to those types of solutions, my company, we make products based off of Faraday technology, which you mentioned. And so what is that? So about 200 years ago, there was a British scientist named Michael Faraday. And what he discovered and then invented is that if you weave conductive metals into certain patterns, you can block and deflect EMF radiation. So that works just like a window shade, right? Just like a window shade blocks and deflects sunlight, Faraday cages can block and deflect EMF radiation in the opposite direction. And historically, this has been used, because I mentioned this is 200-year-old technology, this has been used to protect sensitive electronic equipment, right? Because there's certain types of electronic equipment that will malfunction or function poorly when exposed to EMF radiation. And so people, engineers and industry, they've been putting Faraday cages around certain things for a long time. In that same time frame, technology advanced to such a degree, those weaves of conductive metals You don't need a cage anymore, really. You can get those really, really, really thin fibers and weave them into other fabrics and get the same impact. And so that's what we do at SYB, at Shield Your Body, is we design products that make use of shielding fabric. And I will say, right, so whereas you were just saying, for instance, on Orgonite, how do I know if this is working? With my products, you can actually test and measure their efficacy. And so for all of my shielding products, we contract independent lab testing, and then we post the data and the results for those tests on the website. But it is also possible to verify my product claims just by yourself at home using reasonable quality home testers. So I'm not talking about a $20 EMF tester, but if you get one that starts at about $160, like the Trifields or the Cornets, those are sufficiently accurate where you can verify my product claims for yourself. So all of my shielding products are based on this same technology, and they are all of my product claims are measurable and demonstrable. And so as examples, my best-selling product for the past several years has been my foam pouch. And so we design, it's just a pouch that you put your phone in. The back of the pouch is shielded, but the front of the pouch is not. And so it's designed so that you can carry it in your pocket or on your belt, and the back of the pouch will deflect radiation away from your body, but the front of the pouch isn't shielded, so your phone can still work. Another example, you mentioned the men's underwear. That is obviously designed to protect a very sensitive part of a man's body. It's made from a very similar material. Now, I will say on all of my apparel products and my bedding products, the key shielding element is silver, right? Because it is hypoallergenic as well as antibacterial, anti-odor. When it's in direct contact with your skin for extended periods of time, that's really the quality of material that you want to use. In some of my other products, like I mentioned, the foam pouch, the key shielding component there is actually an alloy made of nickel and copper and cobalt. So you can get shielding out of, as I mentioned, any kind of conductive metal. So even though they're based on similar technology, not each product uses the same exact shielding material. So the men's underwear, long story short, is much more comfortable than if you were have to wear the foam pouch on your body all day long.
Yeah, or you
so
think
we
like
have now a catalog of about
medieval. I would say medieval SB.
Yeah, chainmail
would be chainmail. Like I'm just going to wear chainmail.
Yeah. None of my products, fortunately, are like chainmail. But they know, like the men's underwear is incredibly comfortable. It is, and it's also the same material we actually make our baby beanies out of. It's a really, really comfortable material. So we now have about 24 different products, and we're working on more. And we sell them through our website to customers in over 30 countries, because we have fulfillment and distribution in the United States, Canada, UK, and the EU. And like I say, we're working continually to expand our catalog. Before the recording, you brought up my canopy. It's an expensive product, so I don't want to get people too excited about it if it's beyond their budget. But it is a fantastic form of protection, right? So whereas like the foam pouch is designed to help reduce your exposure from a single device in a single use case, or the men's boxers are designed to protect a single part of the body. The canopy is actually protecting your entire body for extended periods of time, right? For as long as you spend in bed each day. Because of that, it is a very powerful form of EMF protection that can be incredibly useful for particularly sensitive people, but really for everybody, because that type of protection, a canopy, and it includes floor mats, right? So you get the full, every direction you're shielded. It is hard to find a product that can actually provide that level of protection unless you're willing to go to the extent of actually shielding your whole home or apartment, which is incredibly difficult and very, very expensive to do.
Is it true that there is paint?
Yeah.
Someone told me that there was paint, that you can paint your walls with a special type of paint.
Yeah, there's a brand. I don't go around endorsing other or even generally talking about specific other brands. But I will say in this case, the best paint you can get is from a company called Y Shield, the letter Y -Shield. They've been around for a long time. Their paints really work. That is an example, though, of once you get into that type of scale of protection solution, I strongly advocate that people engage the services of an expert. Because once you start shielding part of your home or your whole home, you need to make sure it is done correctly, that you're
Yes.
not redirecting the fields, you're not making the problem worse, you're not creating an even more expensive problem for you to figure out how to fix later on down the line. And so there are building biologists out there with special training
Yeah.
in EMF mitigation. And those, I strongly recommend working with one of those in
And you have
order to
resources for
begin
them on your
planning
website.
and implement. Yes. In fact, we actually offer, if people live in a place where there aren't any of those people around, any of those building biologists, you can book time with one on my website. So if you go to justshieldYourBody.com and click on the consulting link, you can book time with an electromagnetic radiation specialist. And it all happens from the convenience of your home over Zoom. You get a recording. You can ask her everything, all the questions that you have. And she has a lot of experience doing this type of work. And we added the consulting specifically because we were contacted by so many people who have these types of, like, how do I go about protecting my whole home? Or how do I go about, there's a cell tower outside. How can I, what can I do in response to that? And there's no quick and easy answer. And it really does require an expert. And these experts, there's just not a whole lot of them out there. So a lot of people don't live close to one. And so that's why we have the consulting service.
I think the bed canopy would be so fabulous too for people if they are going to be, following, turning off their Wi-Fi and doing all the other recommendations that you have. And you have so much resources and, PDF files on your website for information. But even if you're a electromagnetically sensitive person and you're sensitive to solar flares, we were talking about that a little bit before the show, that solar flares is also a form of EMF.
Yes.
Because you can't really predict.
Yeah. Well, sunlight is. Yeah, I don't know how good they are predicting, so I haven't kept up on that. I don't know about how solar flare prediction works for sure. So I don't know to what degree those are predictable.
There are solar flare tracking apps that I have my clients check out if they are sensitive to them, because I found that a lot of people don't recognize until they start tracking, like, oh my gosh, I get into almost like it might be similar symptoms that EMF sensitive people would be, where they get really tired or they get really disoriented or something after being in the city or a place where there's a lot of EMFs, like after there's a solar flare, and depending on the magnitude of it, they can predict how long it's going to be till it gets in the atmosphere. So those are interesting to know and to follow. But I think that's kind of good information to know, because even if you are turning your Wi-Fi off and doing all the other recommendations, having that canopy would be beneficial to kind of block that. That would probably, I'm assuming, help too. But I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that for sure either, because actually we started talking about this before the interview. As I was trying to find a good answer for you, I realized, I was going through my head, I realized no one had ever asked me, and I've been doing this for a long time, no one had ever asked me about solar flares before. But then when you told it to me, I was stepping through what I knew about them, and I realized it makes perfect sense that people who are electrically sensitive would feel impact from solar flares, because, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation here, right, sunlight is the only form of natural EMF to which life was exposed for so many years. So the sun is a source of EMF. And when there's solar flares, you're getting disruption in the normal types of EMF resulting from that source. And so again, it makes perfect sense that people would feel the impact of that. And we also, I mentioned to you, we also know that solar flares can disrupt electrically sensitive equipment, not just humans, but equipment. So it makes perfect sense that it would apply to humans as well. But I don't actually know which frequencies you would be getting from those types of events. So I can try to find some time and do a little digging into
Well, I'm glad that that's going to open up some curiosity for you too, because I'm really excited to hear what comes of that, because I really do think that there is, even like you said, there's lack of awareness for a lot of people around EMFs in general and then effect. But that's like another layer of it that might be really, really cool for your clientele to have that awareness, and to maybe even do some, I don't know how you're able to measure that, but you guys do such a good job with testing to see, if those are affected. That'd be really neat. So yeah. So why do we not have any regulations to protect us from EMF? Like, what's the deal with that?
Yeah. So, well, we do have some, right? So For instance, cell phones have a maximum amount of radiation that they're supposed to be able to emit. Well, actually, let me step back a bit further. There's a whole class of exposures with no regulation. So, for instance, in the United States, there is no maximum amount of radiation of EMF radiation that can come off a power line. That is totally unregulated.
Wow.
But there are some types of radiation that are regulated. And I was using the example of cell phones. So, cell phone radiation standards are based off of something called the thermal effect, right? So, I mentioned there's a form of EMF called microwave that's used for wireless communication. Your listeners probably recognize that term because of microwave ovens, right? And so what microwave ovens show us is that you can have powerful enough microwaves that it actually cooks. It heats and cooks food or tissue. And what these regulations are designed to prevent is heating. So because if the phone is going to emit so much microwave radiation that it starts heating your body, then everyone knows that is a harmful level of this EMF. And so these regulations exist supposedly to prevent that. Now, that's the first point I want. The first point I wanted to make is there's a whole bunch of exposures that are not regulated at all. The second point I wanted to make is that of the exposures that are regulated, they are regulated to prevent the thermal effect. And the reason that that's important to understand is because the thermal effect is immediate damage, right? If you're getting heated up, that's immediate damage. And so every EMF health and safety regulation for consumers in the United States and most of the world, it exists to prevent immediate damage. But when we're talking about things like development of brain tumors or infertility, or increased rates of miscarriage, or any other of these conditions and diseases that we talked about, those aren't immediate effects. Those are medium and long-term effects. And none of the regulations are designed to adjust our risk or address our risk of forming these medium and long-term health outcomes from these exposures. Those are the two big problems, right? There's a whole class of exposures that aren't regulated at all. And those that are regulated, they're only designed to protect you against these short-term health effects. Now, there's a whole bunch of other reasons why regulations are really flawed. And I don't want to go too into detail on that in this, but I will say one more thing, which I want people to understand. In the United States, cell phone radiation is regulated by an entity called the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission. And when people hear that, they assume that the federal government is testing these cell phones. And that is not what is happening. When these cell phones are released, the manufacturers contract testing at a private lab. And then they determine what numbers to release in terms of, yes, I promise you this phone meets radiation safety guidelines. But the federal government never tests this stuff. It's all based on the honor system. And you don't know what the circumstances of the test were. You don't know how the phone was held during the test. You don't know how strong the signal was during the test. You don't know how many of the wireless connections were on during there's all sorts of reasons why that data that they publish is effectively meaningless. And so when people ask me, for instance, on recommendations on what's the lowest radiation cell phone, I have no idea what to tell them. And I tell them because I don't believe the data that they're publishing on this, because I know the conditions under which these tests are done. And in fact, in France, a few years ago, the government did test about 300 different models of cell phones. And what they found was that 88% of the models that they tested emitted more radiation than the manufacturers said. And several models emitted more than were legally permissible and were recalled from the market. So this is, and again, there's a whole lot of reasons. We could do a whole separate interview just on regulations, because it is something I believe strongly in. And there's a whole lot of reasons why they are insufficient. But those are some of the top ones, right? There's a whole bunch of exposures that aren't regulated at all. The ones that are regulated are designed to attempt to prevent short-term immediate damage. And there's no one out there policing the companies. It's all based on the honor system.
Wow. So what are the things that we can do, that are free, that are easy, that we can really mitigate some of these EMF fields or our exposure?
Sure. Sure. And I have I'll get into some of the big ones. And for those who are interested, if you go to my website at shieldyourbody.com, right there at the top of the homepage, you can just get this guide that tells you some of the most effective ways that you can start reducing your exposure for free and why those are some of the most important differences that you can make. The number one thing I tell people to do is to stop carrying their phones in their pockets or their bras, right up against your body. As we talked about throughout this conversation, there are so many sources of EMF in our world and in our immediate environments. Why do I focus on that being such an important one? Because cell phones are actually very, very, very high powered devices, right? They're designed to be able to communicate over miles. And also that's just the cell phone, right? Because as we mentioned, there's also Wi-Fi, there's Bluetooth, there's NFC, all these other connections. And when it is right up against your body, you are getting the maximum possible dose that device has. And generally for extended periods of time, because you don't just put your phone in your pocket for 10 seconds. You probably put it there and walk around for a couple hours. Then you take it out, then you put it back in a couple hours later. So you're getting extended high doses from these devices. And so never carry your phone in your pocket or your bra, or I should say, if you do, to put it into airplane mode, right? Because airplane mode is your friend. If you have to carry, because sometimes I have to carry my phone in my pocket and I make sure to put it into airplane mode before I do, because that's really, really important. So that is the number one thing that people can and should do. Another great example of this is to turn off your Wi-Fi at night, right? If you're really serious about cutting out the EMF in your life, you will get rid of the Wi-Fi and you'll replace it with wired Ethernet in your home. But I know from dealing with consumers all the time, that is a big step. It's a real investment. It creates a degree of friction and inconvenience in their relationship with technology. So not everyone's willing to do that. So at least turn off your Wi-Fi at night when you're asleep and you're not even using the Wi-Fi. Because that, again, assuming 8 hours of sleep, that's a third of your life. You can get rid of that Wi-Fi exposure. And that makes a difference even if you're in an apartment building and you can see 5, 10 other networks, when you load up, the Wi-Fi selector on your computer, it still makes a difference that you've cut out the one in your apartment. Now, and there's a whole bunch of what I call these the SYP healthy living tips. There's a whole bunch of these, and they all fall into two categories. One is to minimize your use of EMF emitting technology. That is an example of turning off your Wi-Fi at night. And the other is to maximize the distance between your body and the technology when it is in use. So that's an example of not carrying your phone in your pocket. The minimize makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're just turning off an EMF emitting device, it makes a lot of sense that you're getting a lot less exposure from that. Why does the distance one matter so much? Because the power of EMF radiation diminishes exponentially with distance. So if you have your phone and it is, 1 inch away from your body, and then you adjust it, so now it's 2 inches away. All we've done is move it by 1 inch, right? It's still close, but we've moved it by 1 inch. Because we doubled the distance, the power of your exposure has been cut by 75%. That is how important exponential means in this context. So every inch of separation that you can create between your body and your technology makes a really big difference in what your actual exposure is. Another powerful tip from this is never to use your laptop in your lap. You should always keep it further away from you. You should never sleep with your phone or put it into airplane mode when you do. There's all sorts of ways where you can put these two, the minimize use and maximize distance. There's all sorts of ways where you can put those two things into practice in your life. And there's a lot of ways of doing this that do not impinge on your enjoyment of modern technology at all. And once you start, you'll realize all the other things you could be doing.
And I think that when I was looking at your product line too, you had some like laptop pads and things that make it still practical to use a lot of the things like you're saying. You don't have to cut everything out because it does. I think that's one of the things that I can imagine if I was talking to myself 10 years ago, I would have said, hey, you're going to be able to use tech. It's going to be okay. Like with EMF has sensitivity. And even listeners who are not sensitive are going, well, I'm not really experiencing these things, or they don't think they're experiencing, any of the symptoms. They might have migraine
Yeah.
headaches, or they might have cognition issues, or not realize if, that's an issue. Your products are able to be utilized in our tech world. That's really inspiring to me, because I think that I've met so many people that are just very, don't do it, don't use it, so cell phone at all, just really extreme with it. And I think that some people need to do that, but not everybody does. And it's not really realistic, unfortunately, in our culture and our environment.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there's different people are willing to do different amounts of, when it comes to EMF mitigation, just as it is with exercise or diet. There's a lot of people out there who know that they should be eating less sugar, and they're making some efforts, but they're still eating some sugar. Whereas there's other people out there who've cut it completely out of their diet. And we all know, right, the less of that you're going to eat, the healthier it is for you. But you're still willing to engage. That's the kind of the approach I want people to come away from this conversation with. There is no eliminating EMF exposure from your life. In today's world, it is virtually impossible to eliminate exposure to human-made EMF. And so what this is about, what I am doing, is trying to build up awareness so that people can make more intelligent and more mindful decisions about their exposures. And they can cut out the ones that don't add any value to their lives. Because if an exposure is not adding any value to your life, you should certainly cut it out, because otherwise it's just increased exposure to a toxin that you're not, right? But there's other ones where you're like, you know what, I get enough value, I get enough enjoyment out of this. I'm going to engage with technology and get the exposure, because I can't live without it. It's about making more mindful decisions about what applies to me and my lifestyle, and go into it at least knowing some of the risks that help you make that kind of cost-benefit analysis.
Absolutely. And I always say to my clientele and my listeners that what we monitor, we manage. And when we start to monitor our health symptoms, all the different types of alternative therapies or mainstream therapies, medications, whatever lifestyle choices we're making, and if we can look at that contrast of how am I feeling now versus, having this product or not, I think that's the most empowering thing you can do. And I think noticing the difference. I mean, for me, like being in front of this computer too much, I'm really excited to try some of your products, because again, I haven't had access to a lot of products that have that testing and that quality. So I'm really excited to try them. But for me, I get a rash alongside of my neck. And I feel it when I'm in front of my computer too much. I have a monitor up here and a monitor down here. And right now I have lights on me, and I feel that sensation around my neck. And then as a woman, thyroid health is for anybody with thyroid health is a big deal. I get a rash. And I notice the more exposure I have, if I'm editing a lot of videos or I'm in front of the computer a lot more than I normally am, that rash will get worse. And for a while I had to do the skeptical monitoring things. Is it my shampoo? Is it, maybe getting oil on my neck from a conditioner on my hair? No, it's not anything changed. It's not product change. It's not anything I'm eating, because I'm very, again, what you monitor, you can manage. But I think it's nice to have that contrast, so that if you are looking at turning off your Wi-Fi at night, or doing some of the simple, easy, free ways that R has recommended to eliminate, or not eliminate, because you can't eliminate, but lessen the EMF exposure, to track and see how you feel. I think that is the only way that we can educate and really bring people out of this perception of that EMF sensitivity is, like I said earlier, like I'm part of the tinfoil hat society, I think that like that one character in Breaking Bad. What is it? The dad that he can't go out. And when I saw that episode, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this is totally a thing. I remember when it was like this. Now, I wasn't that bad. That wasn't to that extreme. But I know that for my one client I had worked with, that is a real thing. Like even her driving in her vehicle, her car, she was so sensitive to that radiation. So I'm just so grateful that you exist and that you're doing this and you're educating in a way that's just very grounded, very relatable, very science-based, and not inducing fear. Like, what can we do about it? How can we empower ourselves and learn through awareness? So I'm going to send everybody information in the show notes here to check out for all the information on your website, as well as some more information about immune function too. I'm curious if you have any PDFs on that, because we didn't actually get to that today. We might actually want to have you back in the fall or something regarding that, because that's a big topic. Sure.
And I don't have a PDF on it, but I do I do have a link, which I was just checking out, which I can send you to include in the show notes.
Awesome. That would
because
be wonderful.
there is research on the interaction with the immune system. And some of the information might surprise some of your listeners.
Yeah, because a lot of my sensitive people also struggle with autoimmune conditions. And of course, immunity is in general, we want to be, with COVID and all that, and everyone wanting to really make sure that they're doing the best they can with helping their immune system along. I think that's really powerful information that we'll make sure that we share that too. But I'm really just thrilled to interview you. Where were you 10 years ago? But I'm so glad that you're starting up, right? You're doing your thing.
I was starting on this journey.
I know.
That's where I was.
That would have been so cool to have talked to you and be like, so this is real, right? So I'm really glad that we got to connect. And is there anything else you want to share with our listeners at all?
No, I thank you so much for having me on the Mind Body Detox podcast. I love the opportunity to communicate with your audience, but I love the enthusiasm and awareness that you bring to this topic, which obviously I feel is a very important topic. And so this whole conversation has been a real pleasure. So thank you very much. And for your listeners, as we were talking about, there's a ton of free information on my website. Yes, I make and sell products, but that's actually just a small portion of my website. We're actually working now to try to get it to be even a bit more better organized, so it's easier to find, because we have hundreds of articles, as you were talking about. We have multiple ebooks. We have a YouTube channel with lots of educational videos. So there's a whole lot to do at shieldyourbody.com that is free and informational and educational. And so, yeah, that's all at shieldyourbody.com.
I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode and that it's been educational and empowering. I highly encourage, if you are looking to get an EMF detector, to check out EMF radiation in your own home, to check out the show notes, because there is a link that R. has provided for us to make sure you're getting a quality EMF detector. And if you're interested in purchasing anything on shieldYourBody.com website, I highly recommend, first of all, checking it out. But I'm offering you a discount code in the show notes. So make sure you check that out if you are going to be purchasing something, as you don't want to miss out on those discounts. Again, thank you guys so much for listening, and be well until next time, my friends. Thank you for listening to the Mind Body Detox podcast. We wish you wellness and health in your mind, body, and spirit. And be well until next time, my friends.